"Ma'am, step off the bike, now." The command cut through the night like a switch being flipped, sharp and immediate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Naomi Carter didn't move right away. The engine beneath her still hummed low, a steady vibration between her legs, warm metal ticking softly as it cooled under the humid Georgia air. The highway stretched behind her in a long ribbon of dark asphalt, dotted with the distant glow of taillights drifting past at 60 miles per hour. But here on the shoulder, everything had narrowed into flashing red and blue reflections bouncing off chrome, leather, and glass. She slowly lifted her visor, the motion controlled, deliberate, revealing calm eyes that didn't match the urgency in the officer's voice. The beam of a flashlight hit her face instantly, too bright, too close, forcing a squint that she refused to let turn into discomfort. "Engine off," the officer added, louder this time, as if volume alone established authority. Naomi reached down and killed the ignition. The sudden silence left only the crackle of a police radio and the faint hiss of cooling metal, a sound that always reminded her of something unfinished. Two cruisers boxed her in at an angle, doors already open, silhouettes moving with purpose, boots crunching lightly on gravel. The first officer, Mercer, according to the name stitched across his chest, approached with a posture that leaned forward just a little too much, like he had already decided how this was going to go. His partner hung back half a step, scanning, watching, letting Mercer lead. "License and registration," Mercer said. But his eyes weren't on her hands. They traced the bike, the custom detailing, the polished frame, the kind of machine that turned heads in daylight and raised questions at night. Naomi didn't reach for anything yet. She rested her gloved hands lightly on the handlebars, fingers still, shoulders relaxed, breathing even. Around them, a few passing cars slowed, drivers stealing glances, the scene pulling attention the way flashing lights always did. Someone further back tapped their brakes longer than necessary. The air carried the faint smell of hot rubber and gasoline, mixing with the metallic scent of the road after a long summer day. "You hear me?" Mercer pressed, his tone tightening, impatience slipping through the cracks. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, enough to acknowledge, not enough to submit. "I heard you," she said. Her voice level, almost quiet, but it carried. It didn't challenge him. It didn't apologize either. It simply existed, steady in a space that wasn't steady at all. That, more than anything, seemed to irritate him. His flashlight shifted, dipping down to her hands, then back up to her face again, as if searching for something he could name, something he could justify. "Then let's not make this difficult," he replied, though the situation had already crossed that line the moment the lights came on. Naomi finally moved, slowly, deliberately removing one glove, then the other, placing them on the tank with care, every motion measured like she was counting seconds in her head. The red and blue lights pulsed across her jacket, painting her in alternating color, turning her into something the night kept trying to redefine. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed faintly, unrelated but close enough to blur the edges of the moment. Mercer stepped closer, just inside her space now, and for a brief second the world seemed to tighten around that small stretch of highway shoulder. Naomi's gaze didn't drop. It didn't harden either. It stayed exactly where it was, clear, observant, patient. "Officer," she said, not raising her voice, not lowering it. "This stop is already going the wrong way." The words hung there, quiet but weighted, like something placed carefully on a table between them. Mercer let out a short breath through his nose, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Yeah," he said, shifting his stance, the beam of his flashlight steady again. "We'll be the ones to decide that." And just like that, the night tipped slightly, almost imperceptibly, from routine into something else, something neither of them had fully said out loud yet, but both could already feel settling in. The silence after the engine died did not feel empty. It felt controlled, like every sound had been filtered through the authority of the flashing lights now painting the road in pulses of red and blue. Each reflection sliding across Naomi Carter's visor, her jacket, the polished curve of the bike, turning the scene into something staged yet unpredictable, and just beyond the glow, traffic kept moving at full speed. Headlights streaking past in long white lines, drivers slowing just enough to look but not enough to get involved, because moments like this always belonged to someone else until they did. Not. Mercer shifted his weight again, one hand resting near his belt, the other still holding the flashlight too close to her face, not blinding but deliberate, a reminder of who was supposed to control the interaction, while his partner, Officer Kyle Benton, circled slightly wider, positioning himself behind her bike, glancing down at the license plate, then back at Naomi, then back at Mercer, like he was waiting for cues rather than making decisions, and the radio clipped to Mercer's shoulder. Crackled with half-formed dispatch chatter, codes and locations blending into static before cutting out again, leaving only fragments that hinted at a larger world still moving beyond this narrow strip of highway shoulder. Naomi noticed everything. The angle of the cruisers boxing her in, the way Benton kept scanning the passing vehicles instead of focusing on her, the slight tension in Mercer's jaw that did not match the routine tone he was trying to project, and most of all, the way the night itself seemed to lean in, as if holding its breath between each passing car. "You riding alone out here?" Mercer asked, his voice no longer just procedural, now edged with something more personal, something that did not belong in a standard stop, and Naomi let a second pass before answering, just long enough to show she chose her timing, not him. "Yes," she said simply, her tone even, her posture unchanged, hands visible, still resting near the handlebars, not defensive, not submissive, just present. Benton stepped closer now, crouching slightly to inspect the bike, his fingers hovering near the custom exhaust without touching it, eyes tracing the details, the kind of machine that cost more than most people expected, especially from someone they had already decided did not fit the picture in their heads. And he let out a quiet whistle under his breath before straightening again, exchanging a quick glance with Mercer that said more than words. Somewhere behind them, a car slowed further than the others, tires humming against the pavement as the driver angled their phone toward the scene. The faint glow of a screen visible through the windshield, and Mercer noticed it too, his shoulders tightening just a fraction as the presence of a witness shifted the weight of the moment, even if he pretended it did not. "Step off the bike," he said again, this time slower, each word spaced out like he was reinforcing control through repetition, and Naomi complied, swinging her leg over with measured precision, boots touching the gravel with a soft crunch, her movement steady, unhurried, as if she had done this before in situations that carried far more risk than flashing lights and raised voices. The air felt thicker once she stood beside the bike, the distance between them now smaller, more direct, the kind of proximity where tone mattered more than volume, and Mercer took a step closer, lowering the flashlight slightly but not enough to soften its presence. "We are going to sort this out," he said, though it sounded less like reassurance and more like a claim, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm but unreadable, the kind of calm that did not come from ignorance but from awareness, the kind that unsettled people who expected fear or frustration in its place. And somewhere in the background, the radio crackled again, a voice calling out a location that neither officer responded to, because for this moment, everything had narrowed to this roadside, this bike, and this woman who refused to react the way they expected, and that alone was beginning to change the rhythm of the stop. Mercer's confidence did not come from certainty. It came from habit, the kind built over years of being obeyed without question, of reading situations quickly and deciding who belonged and who did not before a single word was exchanged. And right now, standing on the shoulder of a humid Georgia highway with red and blue light flickering across his uniform, he had already written Naomi Carter into a category he trusted more than facts. His eyes moved over her again, slower this time, taking in the clean lines of the bike, the quality of the gear, the way she stood without shifting her weight, and instead of adjusting his assumptions, he doubled down on them. Because people like him did not like being proven wrong in front of an audience, especially not one that might be recording. "That is a serious machine for a late-night ride," he said, voice carrying a thin layer of sarcasm that did not quite hide the edge beneath it. And Naomi did not respond immediately, letting the comment hang in the warm air, her silence neither defensive nor inviting, just controlled. Benton stepped in closer now, less cautious than before, curiosity pulling him forward as he glanced again at the bike's details, then at Naomi, then back to Mercer, as if silently asking whether to escalate or stay back, and Mercer answered without words, straightening slightly, lifting his chin just enough to signal that he was still in charge. "You got proof this bike is yours?" Mercer continued, the question shaped like procedure but delivered like accusation, and Naomi reached slowly toward her jacket pocket, pausing just long enough for both officers to track the movement, making sure there was no misunderstanding about intent. Then she stopped, her hand resting lightly against the leather as she looked back at him. "Before I reach for anything," she said, calm and steady, "I need to understand why I was stopped." And the words were simple, almost textbook, but in the way she said them there was no uncertainty, only precision, like she was placing each piece exactly where it belonged. Mercer let out a quiet exhale through his nose again, that same almost laugh, but this time it came sharper, more irritated, because she had just shifted the conversation without raising her voice, and he did not like losing control of the pace. "Speeding," he replied quickly, though his tone suggested the answer was less about accuracy and more about closing the loop. "And we had a report of a similar bike earlier," he added, stacking reasons as if quantity could replace clarity. Naomi nodded once, not agreeing, just acknowledging, her eyes never leaving his. And in that moment the gap between them felt less like officer and civilian and more like two people measuring each other, each aware that something about this stop did not fit cleanly into routine. Behind them, the car that had slowed earlier rolled forward a few feet, the faint glow of a phone still visible through the windshield, steady, patient, capturing everything without interruption, and Mercer's jaw tightened again, just slightly, as if he could feel the weight of being observed pressing in from the edges. Benton shifted his stance, glancing briefly toward the passing traffic before looking back at Naomi, and for a split second there was hesitation in his expression, a flicker of doubt that did not match Mercer's certainty, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by the same practiced neutrality he had learned to wear. Naomi finally moved again, slowly unzipping her jacket just enough to reach inside. Her motions deliberate, controlled, every second stretched just a little longer than necessary, not to provoke, but to ensure that nothing about this moment could be misunderstood later, and the red and blue lights continued to pulse across her face, her hands, the bike, turning the entire scene into something that felt both public and isolated at the same time, like the rest of the world had faded just far enough away to leave only this narrow strip of asphalt, this exchange of words, and the quiet tension building between assumption and truth. The zipper stopped halfway, the soft metallic teeth catching the light for a split second before Naomi Carter's fingers slipped inside the inner pocket, her movement steady, unhurried, as if the outcome of this moment did not depend on speed but on clarity. And Mercer's flashlight followed the motion instinctively, the beam tightening, narrowing, as though he could control what she reached for simply by watching closely enough. Benton shifted again behind the bike, his boots grinding lightly against the gravel as he leaned in just a fraction more, curiosity still pulling him forward even as something in the air began to feel less predictable than before. Naomi withdrew a slim leather wallet, holding it between two fingers, not extending it yet, just letting it exist in the space between them, visible, undeniable, and for a brief second the scene paused, like everything was waiting to see what would happen next. "I am going to hand this to you," she said, her tone measured, precise. Every word placed carefully, and Mercer gave a short nod, though it felt less like permission and more like expectation, like he had already decided what that wallet would confirm. She extended her hand slowly, the leather catching the red and blue reflections as it moved, and Mercer took it without stepping back, flipping it open with a practiced motion, his eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then narrowing just slightly as the information did not align with whatever he had been prepared to see. For a moment, his expression did not change enough for anyone else to notice, but Naomi saw it, the microsecond where certainty cracked and something else tried to take its place, something less comfortable. Benton leaned closer, angling his body to catch a glimpse of the contents, his brow furrowing as he tried to read over Mercer's shoulder. But Mercer tilted the wallet just enough to block him, not fully, just enough to keep control of the information, as if sharing it too quickly would mean losing whatever authority he still felt anchored to. "Where did you say you were headed tonight?" Mercer asked, but the question came a beat too late, like it had been pulled from a script he no longer fully believed in. And Naomi did not answer immediately, instead watching him, studying the way his grip on the wallet had tightened just slightly, the way his stance had shifted from forward to planted, as though he needed the ground to feel more solid beneath him. The passing traffic continued to hum by, steady and indifferent, but the car that had slowed earlier was still there, now pulled further onto the shoulder behind the cruisers, its engine idling, the faint glow of a phone still visible, unwavering, capturing everything without interruption, and Mercer's awareness of that presence flickered across his face again, quick but unmistakable, before he forced his attention back down to the wallet in his hands. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, unforced. "I did not say," and the simplicity of the answer seemed to land heavier than a longer explanation would have, because it made clear that she was not playing along with the rhythm he had tried to set from the beginning. Benton straightened slightly, glancing from Mercer to Naomi and back again, the hesitation returning, more visible now, as if he was beginning to sense that this stop was not unfolding the way it was supposed to, that the neat lines between authority and compliance were starting to blur. Mercer closed the wallet halfway, not snapping it shut, just enough to pause the moment, his thumb resting along the edge as though he needed a second longer to process what he had seen without admitting that anything had changed, and the red and blue lights continued to pulse across their faces, across the leather, across the asphalt, turning each second into something stretched and sharpened, where every glance, every breath, every small shift in posture carried more weight than the words being spoken, and in that tightening space, the first real hint of uncertainty settled in, quiet but undeniable, like a crack forming beneath the surface of something that had felt solid just moments before. Mercer did not hand the wallet back right away, and that pause stretched just long enough to be noticed, not just by Naomi Carter, but by Benton, by the driver in the parked car behind them, even by the silence between passing vehicles that seemed to grow heavier with each second, and Mercer's thumb traced the edge of the leather once, twice, as if he could smooth over whatever had unsettled him by repeating a familiar motion. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, a dispatcher's voice, breaking through with a location update that he did not respond to, and that alone was unusual enough that Benton's eyes flicked toward him, searching for direction that did not come. "Step over here," Mercer said finally, his voice firmer now, less conversational, as he gestured away from the bike toward the front of the cruiser, not raising his volume, but sharpening his tone just enough to reclaim control of the scene. And Naomi followed without hesitation, her steps measured on the gravel, boots landing softly, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, as if the shift in position did not alter anything essential about the moment. The hood of the cruiser reflected the rotating lights in distorted waves, red sliding into blue and back again, and Mercer placed the wallet down on the metal surface instead of returning it, a small decision that carried weight, turning identification into evidence, turning a simple stop into something more deliberate. Benton moved closer now, no longer hanging back, his curiosity giving way to something quieter, something closer to concern, and he leaned slightly toward Mercer, lowering his voice just enough to suggest privacy, though the words still carried in the open air. "What is it?" he asked, and Mercer did not answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on the wallet as if it might rearrange itself into something easier to process. Naomi watched the exchange without interrupting, her hands now resting loosely at her sides, her breathing slow and even, the kind of stillness that came from training rather than passivity. And in that stillness there was a subtle shift, not visible in movement but in presence, like the center of gravity in the scene had moved without anyone acknowledging it. Mercer straightened again, clearing his throat lightly, the sound small but sharp in the quiet, and when he spoke, he directed his words at Naomi but angled his body just enough to keep Benton within reach. "We are going to verify a few things," he said, choosing each word carefully, as though precision might restore the certainty he had felt minutes earlier, and Naomi gave a single nod, not in agreement, not in resistance, simply acknowledging the statement as part of a process she already understood. Behind them, the idling car's engine hummed steadily, the faint glow of its dashboard lights visible. Through the windshield, the phone still held up, unwavering, and Mercer's awareness of that presence flickered again. A quick glance over his shoulder before returning to the task at hand, and the weight of being seen pressed in from the edges of the moment, making every action feel just a little more permanent. Benton shifted his stance, glancing once more at the wallet on the hood, then at Naomi, then back at Mercer. The hesitation in his expression now more pronounced, as if he was beginning to realize that whatever Mercer had seen inside that leather fold did not match the story they had started with, and that mismatch was beginning to ripple outward, affecting everything from tone to posture to the space between them. Naomi's eyes moved briefly to the wallet, then back to Mercer, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, level, but carried a quiet clarity that cut through the noise of the highway and the pulse of the lights. "Officer, if you are unsure, you can call it in," she said, not offering advice, not issuing a command, just stating an option as though it were the most obvious next step. And that simplicity seemed to land heavier than anything else she had said, because it highlighted what Mercer had not yet done. For a fraction of a second, Mercer's jaw tightened, the smallest visible sign of resistance, of pride pushing back against procedure, and then he reached for his radio, his fingers hovering over the button before pressing down, the click audible. In the quiet, a signal that the situation had crossed an invisible line, that whatever this stop had been at the beginning, it was no longer just that, and the night seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the next piece of truth to surface. The click of the radio button sounded small, almost insignificant, but it shifted the entire weight of the moment, and as Mercer spoke into it, his voice changed just enough to be noticed, less certain, more measured, as though he was choosing each word with care now that someone else might be listening on the other end. "Dispatch, I need a verification," he said, reciting Naomi Carter's information in a tone that tried to stay neutral, but the slight hesitation between details gave him away, and the response did not come immediately, only a soft burst of static followed by a pause that stretched longer than expected, long enough for Benton to glance toward him again, long enough for the hum of passing cars to fill the gap, long enough for Naomi to shift her weight just slightly from one foot to the other, not out of discomfort, but to reset her stance, to stay grounded in a situation that was beginning to tilt. The wallet remained on the hood between them, untouched now, as if it had become something fragile, something that could not be handled casually anymore. And the red and blue lights continued to wash over it, over Mercer's hands, over Naomi's face, turning everything into a repeating cycle of color and shadow that made it harder to tell what belonged to the moment and what was being projected onto it. Benton cleared his throat softly, a quiet sound that felt louder than it should have, and leaned in just enough to murmur, "You think it is legit?" But Mercer did not answer him directly, his eyes fixed ahead, listening for dispatch, waiting for confirmation that would either restore his control or take it away entirely. Naomi watched the exchange without interrupting, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady, but inside that stillness there was awareness, a precise tracking of every detail. The delay on the radio, the shift in Mercer's posture, the way Benton's confidence had started to fade into uncertainty, and she recognized the pattern. The exact moment when authority begins to question itself, but has not yet admitted it out loud. Behind them, the car with the phone had not moved, its presence now part of the scene, a silent witness that made every second feel recorded, permanent, and Mercer's shoulders tightened again as the realization settled deeper, because whatever happened next would not disappear into paperwork or memory. It would exist beyond this stretch of highway. Finally, the radio crackled back to life, the dispatcher's voice clearer this time, sharper, carrying a tone that was no longer routine. "Unit requesting verification, stand by," the voice said, followed by another pause, shorter but heavier, and Mercer's grip on the radio shifted, his fingers pressing just a little tighter against the plastic, as if he could control the outcome by holding on harder. Benton straightened fully now, no longer crouching near the bike, his attention fixed entirely on Mercer, waiting, and Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward the radio, then back to Mercer, her calm unchanged, her breathing even, as though she had already accepted whatever direction this moment would take. The night seemed to narrow again, the highway noise fading just enough to make the radio's next transmission feel louder than it actually was. "Unit, Confirm identification matches federal credentials. Repeat, federal credentials. The dispatcher said, and the words landed not with force, but with clarity, cutting through everything else. And for a fraction of a second, no one moved. Not Mercer, not Benton, not Naomi. As the meaning settled in, Mercer did not speak right away, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking once toward the wallet, then back to Naomi, and something unspoken passed through the space between them. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift. Like the ground beneath the scene had tilted enough that everyone could feel it now, even if no one had said it out loud yet. And the red and blue lights kept pulsing, steady, indifferent, illuminating a moment that had already begun to change direction whether Mercer was ready for it or not. The words federal credentials did not echo. They settled, quiet and heavy, like something placed carefully in the center of the scene where no one could ignore it. And Mercer's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the rigid edge in his shoulders softening just enough to reveal that the certainty he had been holding onto was no longer intact. He lowered the radio slightly, but did not release it, his fingers still wrapped around it, as if letting go too quickly would mean admitting too much too soon. And Benton exhaled quietly beside him, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his eyes moving from Mercer to Naomi and back again, trying to recalibrate everything he thought he understood about the last few minutes. Naomi Carter did not step forward, did not speak, did not change her stance, and that stillness became louder than any reaction could have been, because it made the shift belong entirely to them, not to her, and the red and blue lights continued to move across her face, steady, rhythmic, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Mercer finally looked down at the wallet again, then back at Naomi, and this time his gaze held for a fraction longer, searching, not for confirmation, but for context, for something that would allow him to reframe what had just happened into a version where he was still in control, but the silence between them did not offer him that. Behind them, the idling car remained, the faint outline of the phone still visible, and that presence now felt sharper, more immediate, like a witness that could not be dismissed or ignored, and Mercer's awareness of it lingered in the way he shifted his stance, turning just slightly, so his body blocked the view of the wallet on the hood, a small instinctive move that spoke louder than any words. Benton took a step back, creating a bit more space, his earlier curiosity replaced by something closer to caution, and he glanced once more at Naomi, this time not with assumption, but with a quiet recognition that he had been reading the situation wrong from the beginning. Mercer cleared his throat again, a subtle reset, and reached out to pick up the wallet, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if the object had gained weight in the time it had been sitting there, and when he extended it back toward Naomi, his hand paused just briefly before she took it, a hesitation that marked the moment more clearly than any apology could have. Naomi accepted it without comment, slipping it back into her jacket with the same controlled motion she had used before, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, and that consistency seemed to deepen the shift rather than ease it, because it left no room to pretend that this was anything other than what it had been. The radio crackled again, dispatch asking for confirmation, for acknowledgement, and Mercer pressed the button once more, his voice lower now, tighter. Copy, he said, the single word carrying more weight than a longer explanation would have, and the line went quiet again. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The only sound the distant rush of traffic and the faint ticking of the cooling engine behind them. And in that silence, the balance of the moment had clearly moved, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that everyone standing there could feel it, even if none of them chose to name it out loud. And Naomi remained exactly where she was, steady, observant, waiting, not for permission, but for the situation to finish revealing itself. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted in layers, subtle but undeniable, and Mercer seemed to feel it before he understood it. The way his shoulders no longer held the same rigid edge, the way his stance widened just slightly, as if he needed more balance on ground that had quietly changed beneath him. And for the first time since the lights came on, he did not speak immediately, did not fill the space with instructions or assumptions, and that absence of control was more revealing than anything he had said before. Naomi Carter remained still, her presence steady, her gaze calm but attentive, not pressing, not retreating, simply allowing the moment to unfold without interference. And that restraint carried its own weight, because it left the responsibility of what came next entirely in Mercer's hands. Benton shifted again, but this time it was not curiosity or routine that moved him. It was awareness, the kind that comes when a situation no longer fits the pattern you expected, and he glanced briefly toward the idling car behind them, then back to Mercer, as if silently acknowledging that whatever decision was made now would not stay contained to this stretch of road. Mercer finally exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to mark the transition from reaction to reconsideration, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, less sharp. "All right," he said, though the word did not resolve anything. It only signaled that he knew the direction had changed. The radio remained in his hand, quiet now, but its earlier confirmation still hung in the air, shaping everything that followed, and the red and blue lights continued to pulse across the scene, steady and indifferent, illuminating a moment that no longer belonged solely to authority, but to consequence. Naomi's eyes moved briefly past Mercer, toward the darker stretch of highway beyond the cruisers, and then back again. A small motion, almost unnoticeable, but precise, as if she was tracking more than just the conversation, as if something in the background mattered in a way that had not yet been spoken. Mercer followed her gaze for a fraction of a second, instinct more than intention, and his eyes flicked toward the road behind them, where the steady flow of traffic continued, headlights cutting through the dark in long, unbroken lines. And then he looked back at her, a question forming that he had not yet put into words. "You said this was going the wrong way," he said slowly, not accusatory now, but searching, trying to reclaim understanding rather than control, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her voice even, measured. "I said it because it is," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer landed differently this time, no longer a challenge, but a statement of fact that invited him to look beyond the surface of what he thought he was handling. Benton's brow tightened slightly, his attention shifting between them, sensing that the conversation had moved somewhere deeper than a routine stop, and the hum of the idling car behind them seemed louder now, the presence of that unseen observer pressing in from the edge of the scene. Mercer adjusted his grip on the radio again, not pressing the button this time, just holding it, as if weighing whether to call something in or to wait, and in that hesitation, the moment stretched once more, balanced between what had already been revealed and what had not yet surfaced, and Naomi remained exactly where she was, steady, patient, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharp, as if she already knew that the situation was not finished, that the truth of it had not fully come into view yet, and the night around them felt less like a backdrop now and more like a presence, quiet and watchful, holding something just out of reach, waiting for the next decision to bring it into the light. The question Mercer had not yet asked lingered in the space between them, and Naomi Carter could see it forming before he found the words, the way his eyes kept drifting past her shoulder toward the highway, towards something he could not quite place, and she did not interrupt that process, because timing mattered more than explanation, and this moment needed to arrive. On its own, the steady stream of traffic continued, headlights slicing through the dark in clean lines, but one vehicle stood out now, not because it was moving differently, but because it was not moving at all, a dark SUV parked further down the shoulder, just beyond the edge of the flashing lights, far enough to seem disconnected, close enough to matter, its engine low, almost silent, its presence subtle but deliberate. Benton noticed it next, his gaze narrowing slightly as he followed the same line Naomi had traced seconds earlier, and his posture shifted again, this time not from uncertainty, but from awareness, the kind that comes when something in the environment does not match the flow of everything else. Mercer turned his head fully now, his flashlight lowering as his attention moved away from Naomi and toward the vehicle, and for the first time since the stop began, his focus was no longer fixed on control, but on context, on the possibility that the situation in front of him was only a fragment of something larger. "You see that?" Benton said quietly, not needing to specify, his voice carrying just enough to confirm what both of them were already thinking, and Mercer did not answer right away, his eyes locked on the SUV, watching for movement that did not come. Naomi let the silence stretch just a little longer, then spoke, her tone even, measured. That is why I said this was going the wrong way. And the words landed differently now. No longer abstract, no longer theoretical, but anchored to something visible, something real. Mercer glanced back at her, the question in his expression now sharper, more focused, and for the first time, it was not about her. It was about the situation itself, about what he had stepped into without realizing it. The radio in his hand felt heavier now, not as a tool of control, but as a line to something he had not yet fully connected to, and he lifted it slightly, hesitating, weighing whether to call in what he was seeing or to wait for more clarity, and that hesitation marked another shift, subtle but undeniable. Benton took a step closer to Mercer, lowering his voice again. That car has been sitting there, he said, not a question, just an observation, and Mercer gave a small nod, his eyes still fixed on the SUV, tracking it, measuring distance, angle, presence, all the small details that suddenly mattered more than the stop they had initiated. Behind them, the idling car with the phone remained, its silent recording now capturing a scene that had quietly changed direction, no longer centered on a routine interaction, but on something unfolding just beyond the edge of the lights. Naomi remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but her awareness sharp, focused not just on Mercer and Benton, but on the entire field around them, the highway, the parked SUV, the rhythm of passing traffic, and the space in between, where intention often revealed itself in the smallest movements. Mercer finally spoke, his voice lower now, more controlled. You were watching that vehicle, he said, not accusing, not confirming, but testing the idea out loud, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. Her response simple, precise. I was tracking it, she said, and the word shifted. Everything again, turning the scene from a misunderstanding into something operational, something structured, something that had purpose beyond what either officer had initially assumed. The night seemed to tighten once more, the air heavier, the lights still pulsing, but now illuminating a moment that was no longer about who had control, but about who understood what was really happening. And in that realization, the balance of the situation moved again, quietly but completely, toward something neither Mercer nor Benton had expected when they first flipped on their lights. The word tracking did not rush through the scene. It settled slowly, like a key turning in a lock that had been there all along, and Mercer felt it immediately, the shift from uncertainty to something more dangerous, because now the situation was no longer about whether he had made a mistake, it was about what that mistake had interrupted. His eyes snapped back to the SUV, sharper now, no longer just observing but assessing, measuring distance, angles, possibilities, and the cruiser lights. Suddenly felt too loud, too visible, casting long pulses across the dark vehicle down the shoulder like a spotlight no one had meant to turn on. Benton followed his gaze, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet urgency, the kind that comes when instinct finally catches up with reality, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. If she was tracking it, then he did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to, because the implication hung there, heavy and obvious. Naomi Carter did not move, but her presence shifted again, not in posture, but in focus, her attention now fully aligned with the SUV, every passing second recalculated in her mind, every delay measured against something neither officer could yet see. The idling car behind them remained, its silent recording now capturing a scene that had evolved beyond a roadside stop into something far more complex. And Mercer's awareness of that added pressure flickered again, but this time it did not drive his decisions. It only reminded him that whatever happened next would not be easily undone. Why did you not say something sooner? Mercer asked, the question coming out tighter than he intended, less like blame and more like a grasp for control in a moment that had already moved past him. And Naomi's response came without hesitation, calm, precise. Because you were not listening, she said, and there was no edge in her voice, no accusation, just a statement that landed with a clarity that made it harder to dismiss. Benton exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along the side of his duty belt, not out of habit, but to steady himself, his eyes still fixed on the SUV, watching for any sign of movement, any indication that their presence had already been noticed, And the longer it sat there, still and silent, the more it felt like something waiting rather than something parked. Mercer lifted his radio again, this time without hesitation, pressing the button with a firmer motion, his voice lower, more controlled. Dispatch. We have a vehicle of interest on the shoulder, dark SUV, approximately 200 yards ahead of our position, he said, each word deliberate, each detail chosen carefully, as if precision could regain what had been lost. The response came quicker this time, sharper, confirming receipt, asking for additional information, but Mercer's attention was already shifting back to the road, to the distance between them and the SUV, to the realization that the flashing lights behind him might have already changed whatever outcome had been in motion before he arrived. Naomi took a small step forward, not toward Mercer, not toward Benton, but slightly closer to the edge of the light, her eyes fixed on the SUV, her voice low but steady. If they were waiting, they are not anymore, she said, and the words carried a quiet finality that made Benton glance at her, then back at the vehicle, as if expecting it to move at any second. The highway noise seemed to rise again, the steady rush of cars filling the space. But beneath it, there was a tension that had not been there before, something stretched thin between what had already happened and what was about to unfold, and Mercer felt it. The weight of a decision he had made minutes ago, the ripple effect it had created, and the realization that this was no longer just about authority or procedure, but about timing, about awareness, about whether he could adapt fast enough to a situation that had already moved beyond him. And as the red and blue lights continued to pulse across the road, across the SUV, across all of them, the moment tightened once more, balanced on the edge of something that could not be reversed. The space between intention and consequence had already closed, even if no one had said it out loud yet. And as Mercer lowered the radio slightly, listening to dispatch continue in the background, his focus stayed locked on the dark SUV ahead, waiting for something that might confirm they still had time. But the longer it remained still, the more it felt like that time had already passed. Benton shifted again, this time stepping slightly forward, his body angled toward the road, eyes narrowed, scanning for any subtle change, any flicker of movement inside the vehicle. But the tinted windows reflected nothing back except the distant glow of passing headlights, turning the SUV into a silent shape that revealed nothing and yet suggested everything. Naomi Carter took another small step closer to the edge of the light, not crossing into the darkness, but aligning herself with it, her gaze steady, calculating. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was a new weight. Beneath it, something firmer, more decisive. If they were waiting for a signal, they have already received it, she said. And Mercer felt that sentence land harder than anything before it, because it reframed the entire scene, not as an interruption, but as a trigger. The flashing lights behind him suddenly felt louder, more intrusive. The red and blue pulses no longer just illumination but a broadcast, a declaration of presence that could be seen from far beyond this stretch of road. And he realized, too late, how visible they had made themselves, how obvious this stop had become to anyone watching. Benton glanced quickly at Mercer, the unspoken question now clearer, sharper. "Do we approach?" he asked quietly. But there was hesitation in his voice, not fear, but awareness of stepping into something they did not fully understand. Mercer did not answer immediately, his jaw tightening as he weighed the options, each one carrying consequences that had not been part of his thinking just minutes ago. And in that pause, Naomi's presence remained steady, grounded, not pushing, not pulling, simply existing as the one person in the scene who had already seen this path before it unfolded. "If you go in without context, you escalate it," she said, not instructing, not commanding, just stating it as a fact. And Mercer's eyes flicked to her again, searching for something in her expression, something that could guide him. But what he found was not direction, it was clarity, and that made the decision heavier, not lighter. The radio crackled again, dispatch asking for status, for movement, for confirmation, and Mercer pressed the button once more, his voice controlled but lower now. "Stand by," he said, and released it, buying time he was no longer sure he had. The idling car behind them remained, its silent recording continuing, capturing a moment that had shifted far beyond its original frame. And The presence of that unseen observer now felt almost secondary to the tension building ahead, where the SUV still sat, unchanged, but no longer neutral. Naomi's eyes remained fixed on it, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet readiness in the way she stood, the kind that came from knowing that the next few seconds would matter more than the last 10 minutes combined, and Mercer felt it too. The tightening of the moment, the narrowing of options, the realization that whatever happened next would not be controlled by rank or assumption, but by awareness, by timing, by whether they could read the situation correctly before it moved again. And as the highway noise continued to flow around them, steady and indifferent, the scene held on that edge, suspended between action and consequence, waiting for the smallest shift to push it forward into something that could not be undone. The moment did not break with movement. It tightened with understanding, and Mercer felt it settle in his chest like something heavy that could not be shifted by rank or voice. Because this was no longer about controlling a stop. It was about recognizing the cost of having already disrupted something that had been in motion long before he arrived. His eyes stayed fixed on the SUV, but his focus had changed, no longer searching for confirmation, but for consequence, for the subtle signs that would tell him whether the situation ahead had already adapted to their presence. And in the stillness of that vehicle, in the way it did not react, did not move, did not signal anything at all, he began to understand that stillness could be its own answer. Benton took a slow breath beside him, his earlier question about approaching now replaced by a quiet awareness that stepping forward without clarity would not restore control. It would only deepen whatever had already shifted, and he glanced once more at Naomi Carter, not for instruction, but for perspective, because she was the only one here who had entered this moment already knowing what it was. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence, did not step into authority even though she now clearly held it, and that restraint carried a different kind of power, one that did not need to be asserted to be felt, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, grounded. "You still have a chance to not make it worse," she said, and the words did not sound like a warning. They sounded like an option, a narrow one, but real. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in the effort of adjusting, of letting go of the version of this moment he had been operating under and accepting the one in front of him now. And he nodded once, a small motion, almost invisible, but enough to signal that he had heard her. The radio in his hand felt different now, not a tool to command, but a line to coordinate, and he raised it again, pressing the button with a controlled, deliberate motion. "Dispatch, hold all additional units," he said, his voice steady, choosing restraint instead of escalation, and the response came quickly, acknowledging the instruction, shifting the flow of support before it could build into something larger. The red and blue lights behind them continued to pulse, but Mercer glanced back at the cruiser and reached toward the control panel, his fingers hovering for a brief second before dimming the intensity, reducing the visual spread of their presence. And the immediate effect was subtle but real, the scene shrinking slightly, the highway reclaiming some of its darkness, the moment becoming less of a broadcast and more of a contained space. Benton stepped half a pace back, aligning himself with the change, his posture less rigid now, more responsive, and he kept his eyes on the SUV, watching, waiting, not for action, but for confirmation that the shift they had made had been enough. Naomi remained where she was, her gaze steady, her breathing even, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in her posture, not approval, not relief, just recognition that Mercer had finally moved in a direction that matched the reality of the situation. The idling car behind them continued to record, but its presence now felt distant, less central, because the real focus had narrowed to the space between the officers and the SUV, where intention and consequence were still balancing, still deciding what would come next. And as the highway noise flowed steadily around them, the moment held again, not as a mistake unfolding, but as a choice being corrected in real time, fragile, incomplete, but real, and Mercer stood in that space, no longer trying to dominate it, but trying to understand it, knowing that what he did next would not erase what had already happened, but it might still shape what followed. The night did not resolve with a sudden movement. It settled, slowly, like tension releasing from something stretched too tight for too long. and Mercer stood there with the weight of it still in his chest, watching the dark SUV, as if expecting it to confirm what had already been decided in silence. But it did not move, not yet, and that stillness now felt different, no longer threatening, but distant, as if whatever window had existed before had already closed. The reduced lights behind them cast a softer glow across the road, no longer spilling far into the distance, and the highway began to reclaim its rhythm. Cars passing at full speed again, drivers no longer slowing to look, the moment fading from public spectacle back into something contained, something private, even with the idling car still present behind them. Benton shifted his stance one last time, exhaling slowly, his shoulders dropping just slightly, the tension leaving him in pieces rather than all at once, and he glanced toward Mercer, not for direction now, but with a quiet understanding that the situation had changed in a way neither of them could undo, only carry forward. Naomi Carter remained where she was for a few seconds longer, her gaze still fixed on the space where the SUV sat, her posture steady, her awareness sharp even as the intensity of the moment began to ease, and then, without urgency, she stepped back toward her bike, each movement controlled, deliberate, as if returning to something familiar after stepping briefly into something that required more than presence, something that required restraint. Mercer turned toward her, the words forming before he fully decided to say them. And when he did, his voice was lower, stripped of the earlier edge. "Agent Carter," he said, using the title not as formality, but as acknowledgement, and there was a pause after it, a space where more could have followed, but he did not fill it with excuses or explanations, because both would have sounded smaller than what had actually happened. Naomi paused beside her bike, one hand resting lightly on the handlebar, and she looked at him, not with judgment, not with approval, just with a clarity that did not need to be explained, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, even, but carried a weight that settled deeper than any raised tone could have. "What matters is what you do when you realize you were wrong," she said, and the sentence did not linger as criticism. It remained as something else, something closer to a line drawn not on the road, but inside the moment itself. Mercer held her gaze for a second, then nodded once, the motion small but real, and Benton glanced between them, absorbing the exchange without interrupting, understanding that this was not something that required commentary, only recognition. Naomi reached for her helmet, lifting it with the same measured control she had carried through the entire encounter, and as she placed it back on, the soft click of the visor lowering sounded final in a way nothing else had, a quiet punctuation to everything that had unfolded. She swung her leg over the bike, settling into position, her hands returning to the controls with familiarity, and for a brief moment, the scene returned to where it had started, a rider on the shoulder of a highway, lights reflecting across polished metal, the night stretching out ahead. The engine came to life again, low and steady, the vibration returning beneath her, and she did not look back as she eased the bike forward, merging smoothly into the flow of traffic, her taillight fading into the distance, becoming just another point of red among many. Mercer and Benton remained on the shoulder, the reduced lights still turning, the highway moving past them as if nothing had happened, but the silence that followed was different now, not empty, but full of something that would not disappear with the next call, something that would stay, quiet and steady, long after the lights were turned off and the road returned to darkness.